Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The thing about funerals is that no matter how many people show up, the silence always feels louder than any crowd. You could pack the church to the walls or stand around a hole in the ground with 5 people, and still, it sounds like a scream no one hears. That's how it felt that morning when we buried my mother. Cold February sky, gray like wet cement, and air so still it almost felt staged. The kind of day where nothing moves unless someone makes it. I hadn't cried. Not yet. Not even a crack. My palms were tucked deep in my coat, and I kept my head down, mostly out of habit, partially because I didn't want to see the way people looked at Luke. Or maybe the way they didn't look at me. Luke gave the eulogy. Of course he did. He marched up there like he was receiving a medal, clearing his throat the way he always did when he wanted attention without asking for it. His tie was straight, his coat perfect, his words rehearsed like he'd practiced them in the mirror that morning. Maybe he had. Every sentence was about her achievements, her dignity, her love for her children, plural, like he couldn't even say my name. And not once, not one goddamn time, did he look at me. It wasn't that I needed a moment or some grand acknowledgement. I just wanted honesty. Something real. But Luke never did real. He did control. When it ended, the crowd did what crowds do. They mingled. They hugged. They murmured phrases like sorry for your loss, and she was a wonderful woman, like it wasn't just her body in a box 15 feet away. And then there was Luke again, carving through people like he owned the place, making eye contact with those who mattered, ignoring those who didn't, until, finally, he made his way to me. He waited until we were alone, standing off near the casket, with just enough distance from the noise for him to drop his voice into a low whisper. I didn't even see him coming. She never loved you, he said. Just like that. No hesitation, no blink. You were an accident. She told me that when you were 7. The thing is, Luke has always had a talent for cruelty. Not the loud kind, not the stuff people notice. The kind that slips between your ribs and settles like ice behind your lungs. The kind that you don't feel until hours later, when you're lying awake and it starts to burn. I didn't flinch. I didn't say a word. Just stared at the wood grain on her coffin and nodded, like he'd told me the sky was blue. That seemed to piss him off more than if I'd fought back. He waited. Nothing. Then walked away with that smug little tilt in his jaw, like he'd won. But here's the thing. As he turned, my eyes caught something odd. Just barely poking out beneath the flowers arranged on top of the casket was a white envelope. Not one of those thin, store-bought sympathy cards people forget to sign. This one looked deliberate. Heavy paper. My name on the front, in her handwriting. I hadn't seen her write in months. The Parkinson's made it too hard. But there it was, in pen, not pencil, a shaky but unmistakable Evan. I stood frozen for a moment, wondering if anyone else had noticed. They hadn't. No one ever looked at me long enough to notice much of anything. I stepped forward, adjusted the corner of the flower arrangement like I was just being respectful, and slid the envelope into my coat pocket without anyone seeing. Or maybe they did and didn't care. Hard to tell. I stayed for another hour after that, pretending to mingle, nodding at second cousins I couldn't name, shaking hands with people who used to pinch my cheeks when I was a kid and hadn't said 2 words to me since. Luke left early. Said he had a flight back to Denver. He always made sure to mention where he was flying from. Sounded important, I guess. Back at the house, the silence hit harder. Mom's absence wasn't just a missing seat at the table, it was everywhere. Her slippers still by the front door. A cardigan over the armrest. A half-finished crossword on the kitchen counter. All those tiny pieces of someone that don't know they're supposed to stop existing when the person dies. I sat at the table, stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. It felt wrong, like I was breaking into something sacred. But I did it anyway. Her writing inside was worse than the front. Almost unreadable in places. But she'd written a lot. A whole letter. Not a farewell, not a poetic goodbye. Just a confession. Or maybe an explanation. It started with, "If you're reading this, I'm gone," and that's the only reason I could say these things. She talked about fear, about guilt, about making choices that felt right in the moment but haunted her afterward. She talked about Luke, how she'd adopted him after she lost her first child, long before I was born. How she'd clung to him like a raft in a storm, even when she knew he didn't love her back. And then she talked about me. How I came along later, unexpected. She said she was distant because she didn't know how to be a mother to two so different boys. That she was ashamed of how she'd let him dominate everything, including her. And that she always thought there'd be more time to fix it. And then she wrote something that hit me like a freight train. "You were never the accident, Evan. You were the only thing I did right." I sat there for a long time after that, just staring at those words. Everything Luke said at the funeral, every sneer, every sideways glance from relatives who only ever saw him as the successful one, it all started to feel like a bad dream. A lie I'd been tricked into living. I don't know how long I sat there. Hours, maybe. Eventually, I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Placed it under my pillow like I was 10 years old again and needed something to believe in before sleep. I didn't call Luke. Didn't respond to the passive-aggressive text he sent later that night asking if I was okay, little bro. He never called me that before. It was always Evan. Always cold. That's how I knew he was rattled. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reply. I just stared at the words again, over and over, in her shaky script. "You were the only thing I did right." That night, for the first time in years, I didn't dream about being forgotten. But something told me that Luke's nightmare was just beginning. I sat with that letter in my hands until the light outside started to slip behind the neighbor's fence, and the living room looked like it belonged to someone else. It had been my mom's house, technically, but never once did it feel like it belonged to me. You can live in a place your entire childhood and still feel like a guest. The kind of guest no one asked for, the kind who showed up late to the party and took the last seat. That's how I always felt growing up. Luke would walk through the front door and the house would come alive, his voice echoing down the hall, Mom stepping out of the kitchen with that soft look on her face like the sun had just cracked through the windows. I'd follow after, shoes still half-tied, and get nothing more than a distracted nod or a sigh about the mud on my pants. For years, I thought maybe I deserved it. Maybe there was something broken in me she couldn't fix or didn't want to try fixing. But that letter cracked the ground I'd built my entire identity on. She hadn't been cold because she hated me. She had been distant because she was scared. Scared of what it would mean to admit she'd loved me more than she ever loved Luke. Scared of what it would do to her carefully maintained image as the strong, fair, proper mother. Scared of what Luke might do if he found out he wasn't blood. There it was, in her words, written with the unsteady hand of a woman who waited far too long to say what mattered most. She wrote about the miscarriage she never told anyone about, not even Dad, back when he was still alive. A baby girl, lost at 6 months, back when she still believed in prayers. The grief swallowed her whole, she said. And Luke had been the answer, the solution. Or so she thought. She adopted him from a Catholic agency upstate. Blonde-haired, quiet, for years old. Already carrying shadows no one could see. He was always so polite to strangers, she wrote. But to me, there was distance. Like he knew I wasn't really his, and he hated me for pretending I was. She tried, though. God, she tried. Expensive schools. Tutors. Therapy when he started hurting animals and lying without reason. But by the time he was 16, she stopped hoping he'd change. She just hoped he wouldn't get worse. Then I came along. It was an accident, sure. She didn't argue that part. I was 39, she wrote, and I thought the nausea was food poisoning. Then 3 months passed, and suddenly I had a heartbeat inside me. She didn't expect to carry me to term. Didn't even tell Luke until I was almost due. And when I was born, she said she cried for the first time in a decade. Not out of fear. not out of sadness, but because, in her words, you were real and mine and soft in a way I'd forgotten life could be. So why the distance? Because she couldn't afford to let Luke see her love me more. Couldn't risk what that might trigger in him. He resented you from the first second, she wrote. And I failed you both by pretending I didn't notice. But she noticed. She always noticed. Every time Luke snapped at me, or looked at me like I didn't belong, or lied to get me in trouble, she saw it. And she said nothing, because she thought that was the safest thing to do. You were never the accident, Evan, the letter said, near the end. You were the only thing I did right. And here's where something really weird happened. I read that line over and over again, like it would change the more I stared at it. My eyes drifted up to the top of the page, to the date written in her trembling hand, August 32nd, 2021. That stopped me cold. August 32nd? I blinked. Read it again. There is no such date. It was right there in ink, but completely impossible. Like a little tear in reality, like even her final words couldn't get through the fog of confusion she'd lived in for years. Maybe she meant August 31st, and her hands just slipped. Or maybe she was already fading when she wrote it, drifting somewhere past time, past days and calendars. Part of me wanted to laugh, part of me wanted to cry, and a small, petty part of me wondered how many people would catch that if I ever showed them the letter. Because it wasn't just a typo. It felt symbolic somehow. Like she'd been living in a world where time never quite lined up right. A world where grief had no expiration and guilt had no schedule. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat in the dark with her letter in my lap and the quiet pressing in from all sides. The kind of quiet that makes you remember every cruel word your brother ever said and wonder how different things could have been if your mom had just told the truth earlier. I wasn't even angry, not really. I was numb. Hollow. Like someone had scooped out the hurt and left an echo behind. Then, at exactly 8:17 the next morning, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. Mr. Caldwell, a calm woman's voice said on the other end. This is Danielle Petrosian from the law office of Rivers and Moore. I'm calling about your mother's estate. I didn't speak, not right away. She filled the silence like she was used to it. We're finalizing her will and need you to be present this afternoon. She left something for you. The line went quiet after that. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt something in my chest that wasn't grief or rage or numbness. It was curiosity. What the hell had she left me? And more importantly, did Luke know? Because if he didn't yet, he would soon. And something told me, whatever it wasn't going to be small. The law office was tucked between a dentist's clinic and some nameless insurance agency, the kind of bland corporate space where everything smelled like stale carpet and quiet desperation. The waiting room had those uncomfortable chairs no one ever sits in unless they're forced to face something they'd rather avoid, and for me, this morning felt exactly like that. Luke was already there when I arrived, of course. Early, smug, sitting cross-legged like a man waiting to collect a trophy he earned decades ago. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his coat looked like it had never seen real weather. He didn't look up when I walked in, just muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, better late than never. I didn't respond. I figured the lawyer could do the talking. Danielle Petrosian, sharp-voiced and surgically calm, appeared from the back offices a few minutes later and greeted us both with that detached tone people use when they're about to drop something heavy but pretend it's light as air. She led us to a small conference room with no windows and too much fluorescent light. The kind of room that makes you aware of every inch of your skin. Thank you both for coming, she began, sliding a thin folder onto the table between us. Luke was already leaning forward, hands clasped, probably picturing himself strolling through our mother's old house with a fresh real estate agent in tow. He always had a thing for fast flips and faster cash. He talked about turning her place into a short-term rental years ago, said it was too much house for a widow and a mistake. Danielle opened the folder, glanced at us both, then began to read. I, Margaret Caldwell, being of sound mind and full mental capacity at the time of this writing, do hereby declare this to be my final and legally binding will and testament. Her voice was even, clinical, not a tremble in her delivery, not a flicker of surprise, and yet every word she read sent a quiet tremor through the room. Luke didn't flinch at first. When she read that the house would not go to him, he barely blinked. When she moved on to the savings accounts, the retirement fund, the stocks she'd been quietly building over decades, still, he kept his face mostly still. But I could see the way his jaw shifted, the way his knees started bouncing under the table, the way he finally, truly looked at me for the first time in years, like I'd shown up wearing his suit to his own wedding. All assets, Danielle continued, including property, financial holdings, and material possessions of sentimental or personal value, are to be transferred solely to my biological son, Evan Caldwell. I didn't move. Not a smile, not a breath. Just stared at the grain of the table and waited. Luke finally broke the silence. "Bullshit," he said, the words slapping the air like a hand across a face. "This isn't right." She was sick. She didn't even know what year it was last December. You can't tell me she knew what she was doing. Danielle, to her credit, didn't blink. She slid a flash drive across the table toward me with 2 fingers, like it was a check for $100, not the next detonation in our family's quiet war. She recorded a video, Danielle said evenly. Clear-headed, specific. We did it 2 months before she passed. I advised her to do so. Would you like to watch it now? Luke's face turned the color of spoiled milk. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just sat there, twitching, like he wanted to scream but didn't know which direction to aim it. She said you'd react this way, Danielle added, almost as an afterthought. Luke leaned forward, hands on the table, that old fire in his eyes, except it wasn't fury this time. It was fear. Not of me. Not of Danielle. But of something bigger. Something that looked a lot like the truth. She didn't mean it, he snapped. He manipulated her. He's always been sneaky. Quiet types like him, they worm their way in, get sympathy. You should have seen the way she treated him, like a stray dog she couldn't figure out how to put down. Danielle didn't flinch. She just repeated herself, calm and brutal. She knew exactly what she was doing. And she made her decisions very clear. Luke slumped back in his chair. For the first time in his life, I think he realized the audience was gone. No one left to impress. No one left to convince. The spotlight had dimmed, and all that was left was the echo of everything he thought he was entitled to, slipping out of reach. I picked up the USB drive slowly, feeling its weight in my hand like it was something heavier than plastic and metal. Danielle met my eyes for the first time since I'd walked in. "There's more you'll want to see," she said quietly. "It's personal. Personal." That word stuck with me. Not legal. Not financial. Personal. Something deeper than documents. Something meant only for me. Luke stood up too fast, knocking his chair backward. It clattered to the floor, but no one picked it up. He didn't say another word as he stormed out, not even a final insult, not even one of his usual digs. Just silence and the slam of a door that sounded far too final. When I left a few minutes later, the city looked different. The cars sounded muffled. The people looked smaller. Maybe it was just me. I clutched the USB in my pocket like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Because now I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't the end of it. Not even close. I didn't watch the video that night, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because I already knew it would change something I couldn't undo. It sat there on the edge of my desk, the USB drive no bigger than a paperclip, but heavier than anything I'd held in years. I walked around it like it might bite. I cleaned the kitchen even though it was already clean. I scrolled through old voicemails and deleted ones from telemarketers and dentists, like some ritual to delay the inevitable. But by the next morning, After the third cup of coffee and the second failed attempt at pretending I still had a normal life, I finally plugged it in. The screen blinked once, then came to life with the choppy resolution you'd expect from a handheld hospice cam. The frame shook at first, then settled, revealing a plain white wall, some ugly painting of a mountain, and then her. My mother. Sitting up in bed, propped by pillows, her hair pulled back, thinner than I'd ever seen it, but eyes still sharp. Still her. A nurse's voice off-screen asked her to state her name and the date, and she did, slowly but clearly. Margaret Caldwell. November 2nd, 2021. No hesitation. No sign of confusion. Then the nurse asked if she was doing this of her own will, and she nodded. Yes, I need to. What followed wasn't just a will explanation. It was a confession. Not rushed, not dramatic, but deliberate. Like she'd rehearsed it in her mind 1,000 times and knew there wouldn't be a second take. She started with Luke. I adopted Luke when I was 32, she said. I had just lost a daughter. She wasn't even born yet. Still 6 months inside me and then gone. Her voice didn't crack when she said it, but her hands did twitch in her lap, like she was gripping something invisible. I thought if I moved quickly, if I filled the hole fast enough, maybe it wouldn't collapse. She explained how she found Luke through a small Catholic agency out of state. No background checks like today. Just money and need and signatures. He was 4. Blonde. Quiet. Smiled during the interview. Said please and thank you with eerie precision. The agency said he'd been through some things, but that he was resilient. A word that, she later admitted, meant damaged but polite enough not to make a scene. He never looked at me like I was his mother, she said, staring somewhere past the camera. Not even once. And when Evan was born years later, I saw something in Luke's eyes that scared me. Then she went further than I was ready for. She described incidents that made my skin go cold. A neighborhood cat found dead in our backyard when I was 6. Scratched up, half buried. A classmate of Luke's in middle school who stopped coming over after one visit, her parents never explaining why. The broken window blamed on the wind. The babysitter who quit after one night and refused to explain. I remembered these things vaguely, like puzzle pieces I'd never tried fitting together. But she had. And worse, she had hidden them. Paid for them. Smoothed over the damage because she believed, at the time, that it was what a mother should do. The girl he hurt when he was 16, she said, and this time, her voice did falter. I paid her family. It didn't make it right, but it made it go away. I felt something sour rise in my throat, like a lifetime of silence had curdled into something physical. She had known. She had always known. And yet, she let me grow up under the same roof with him. Let me share meals, share birthdays, share everything with someone she had feared and protected at the same time. Then, she looked into the camera. Not past it. Not through it. Directly into it. Into me. You were the only one who ever made me feel like a mother, she said. Not because you were perfect, but because you looked at me like I was enough. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry. Not yet. There was more. I loved you differently, she said. Not better, but real. And I'm sorry I let you think for even a second that you were less than him. She paused then, swallowed hard, and for a long beat, I thought she might stop there. But she didn't. Do what you want with this, Evan, she said finally. But maybe it's time people know who Luke really is. And then the screen went black. I sat in that silence for what felt like hours, but it was probably less than 10 minutes. The video had been 13 minutes and 21 seconds long. 13 minutes to burn down everything I thought I knew about the family I came from. I didn't move. Didn't replay it. Didn't need to. Every word was etched into my memory like a scar. I thought about the neighbors who still sent Luke Christmas cards. The family friends who still called him such a successful man. The old pastor who once said Luke had leadership in his bones. I thought about all the lies we tell ourselves about people like him, and the lies we're told in return. And then I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't just angry at my mother. I wasn't just disgusted with Luke. I was furious with myself for ever believing that his approval meant anything. For shrinking myself to fit into the mold of lesser brother. For letting a man like that shape the way I saw my own worth. I ejected the USB, slipped it back into its tiny plastic case, and placed it on the kitchen counter. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. Not yet. But I knew one thing for damn sure. If Luke thought the will was the end of the story, he was about to find out how wrong he was. Because the truth wasn't just out there now. It was mine. And I was finally ready to use it. I didn't go public with the video. I didn't send it to the family group chat that still included second cousins who thought Luke walked on water just because he once bought our grandmother a flat-screen TV. I didn't send it to the church where he still occasionally made donations in Mom's name, or the local Rotary Club that had him speak 3 years ago about discipline and self-made success. I didn't go to the police. I didn't contact a reporter. Not because I was trying to be noble or spare him or protect her reputation. I didn't do it because I realized very quickly there are quieter, sharper ways to ruin someone like Luke. The kind of man who measures worth in applause doesn't understand what to do when no one claps anymore. And the thing about silence, real silence, is that it lingers longer than any scream. I waited exactly 37 days. I didn't even check in on him during that time. Didn't call, didn't text, didn't drive by his place to see if his Lexus was still in the driveway. I figured if he was unraveling, he'd make noise eventually. And he did. Not in words, but in paperwork. The foreclosure notice went up in week 5. He hadn't paid the mortgage since December, probably expecting he'd have the inheritance by now to catch up. But he didn't. Because I had it. All of it. Every last dollar he thought was his by default. I showed up to the auction wearing jeans and a t-shirt, standing next to men in wrinkled suits who didn't recognize me. The house was up for grabs at a starting bid of $78,000. Some guy in a windbreaker raised it to $80. Then another bumped it to $85. I waited. Didn't even blink. Just raised my number when it hit a lull at $92. $100, I said, and the room got quiet. Not $100,000. Just $100. The auctioneer blinked. He looked at the paperwork, looked back at me, then cleared his throat and announced to the room that due to a mix of legal technicalities and the size of the outstanding debt, the asset had been reassessed and the minimum bid had changed. The room collectively groaned. The men in suits lowered their paddles and walked out grumbling about wasting a damn morning. I signed the deed, wrote the check, and walked out owning the house my brother used to brag about at every Thanksgiving since 2012. And then I waited another 3 days, just to let it sting a little more. When I finally showed up at his doorstep, he was sitting on the porch, wearing a stained hoodie and the same jeans from 2 weeks ago. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not thinner, just diminished. Deflated in a way that had nothing to do with weight and everything to do with pride. I tossed the keys at his feet. Bought it for $1, I said, and let it hang in the air like the final note in a song no one wanted to hear. Guess that makes me the new golden boy. He didn't shout. He didn't swing at me. He didn't even swear. He just looked at the keys, then up at me, and for the first time in both our lives, Luke Caldwell didn't have a single word to say. Not one. His mouth opened slightly, as if instinct tried to force some insult through, but nothing came. It was like watching a statue try to cry. I turned and walked away, not because I needed to feel cinematic, but because I didn't want to see what came next. That kind of silence is a private thing. You don't intrude on a man when he meets the bottom of the pit he spent a lifetime pretending didn't exist. Weeks passed. Life resumed. Kind of. I spent time sorting Mom's things. Gave away most of it. Kept the letter. Kept the video. I didn't know what to do with them, not yet. They didn't feel like tools or weapons anymore. Just artifacts. Proof of a history I hadn't understood while I was living through it. Then came the envelope. It was in a safe deposit box I'd forgotten she even had. The key had been buried in the back of her jewelry drawer, tucked under a tangle of necklaces no one had worn in years. The note inside wasn't from her. It was from Aunt Carol. Her handwriting was always a mess, slanted, impatient, like she couldn't wait for the pen to catch up with her thoughts. It said this: she was going to change it. Back to 50-50. She said it wasn't fair to leave Luke with nothing, even after everything. I told her no. I told her you deserved at least this much. I convinced her not to change it. I read the sentence again. I convinced her not to change it. Suddenly, the foundation under my little revenge cracked just a bit. So, it hadn't been some final act of maternal clarity. It hadn't been justice, not really. It had been influence. External. Carol's. A woman who'd seen me cry in her kitchen when I was 10 and never forgot. A woman who decided, for reasons both kind and complicated, that I should win. That Luke should lose. And that meant, at least in some small part, I didn't win because I was the better son. I won because someone else made sure I did. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope, staring out the window for a long time after. The sun was low. The street was quiet. Somewhere, a sprinkler clicked on. I still didn't regret it. Not the auction. Not the silence. Not the keys on the porch. But a strange emptiness settled in my chest anyway. Like a hollow echo in a place where a solid truth was supposed to live. So no, maybe I wasn't an accident. But I wasn't exactly chosen either.